Welcome to Lost in Transmission, Modern New Testament Textual Criticism, and this is a deeper dive for those who want to learn more than what a 2-hour workshop might provide. So I'm uploading these videos that give a fuller treatment. And there'll be a lot of reading from textbooks and so on in this video, and we'll go over a lot more details than what the 2-hour workshop might provide. And so, first of all, let's start by reading a transmission article. This is an article from the New American Bible, the second edition study Bible from Oxford University Press, article written by Donald Sr., member of the American representative on the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And so the title of this article is The Transmission of the Biblical Text and Its Modern Translations. We'll just read the highlighted parts. Each modern reader of the Bible is in debt to countless number of people, Jewish and Christian, who lovingly handed on to the next generation the treasures of the Bible. For much of the biblical history, such transmission of the biblical tradition was done orally, not in written form. Stories, sayings of great teachers and leaders, hymns, and poetry were lovingly memorized and handed down from parents to children, teacher to disciple, from leader of prayer to congregation, and thereby forming the growing body of the biblical heritage. In ancient and in some modern cultures, oral transmission of important literature was not a casual, haphazard affair. And let's stop right there. For example, in the Old Testament, there are many mnemonics, things that make the text easy to memorize. For example, Psalm 119 is acrostic, and several of the songs are acrostic, where one paragraph begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then the next Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, and so on. And so you'll find the Old Testament is highly structured. We have patterns and couplets and so on that lend itself to easy memorization. We don't have that so much in our modern culture, where we're very much dependent upon the written and through mass media, actually. Anyway, let's continue with our article. But as styles of writing and writing materials became more sophisticated in Israel, and when it had the social organization under the monarchy to have archives and develop an educated class of scribes, then undoubtedly some parts of the Bible were preserved in written form as well. In the New Testament, many of the gospel materials were first preserved in oral form. Sayings of Jesus, his parables, the stories about his healings, his conflict with opponents, and the narrative of his passion would have been preserved and transmitted in a variety of settings such as liturgy, instruction within the home, or small Christian communities, or perhaps even more formally in some early centers of Christian learning. But eventually these oral materials were gathered and put in written form by the evangelists. It is likely that the oral transmission of the biblical materials, both Old and New Testaments, continued to exist and be employed even after the biblical text had been put into writing. Paul's letters and other New Testament texts, such as the Catholic epistles and the book of Revelation, were composed or dictated into written forms immediately. No original manuscript of any biblical book exists. Copyists from one generation to the next transcribe the biblical materials and enable them to be available for subsequent generations. The earliest written manuscripts we have of some Old Testament biblical materials date from the 1st century BC. These were part of a wealth of written materials discovered in 1948 on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea and thereafter called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of the other early written materials for both the Old and New Testaments would be papyrus fragments of biblical passages dating from the early 2nd century AD and more complete manuscripts of the Bible on parchment from the 3rd and 4th century AD. The science of textual criticism attempts to trace the relationships of ancient manuscripts to each other and to reestablish the most reliable form of the biblical text. Here's the bibliography for this series. You can pause the video if you want. I'm not going to read all of this. Textual criticism traditionally. I'm phrasing it that way because there was a major watershed development in the 21st century that the New Testament is being constructed by a very new technique called the coherence-based genealogical method, which we'll get to later in the series. There's also another major shift prior to that for the way it was done for centuries, and that's sort of the 20th century where Westcott and Horton and others introduced what we call textual criticism as a discipline formally, where we came up with what we call critical Greek New Testaments and critical versions of text that underwent a more systematic approach to restoring text and resolving disagreements. So first of all, it would be helpful to, let's try to get a definition of what textual criticism is. So textual criticism is the discipline that tries to restore the text, and we need textual criticism for the New Testament, for all the books, all 27 books, because the originals are lost. And so you need textual criticism when the original document of a written work has been lost and that the existing copies no longer agree with each other. And so as far as we know, all the New Testament originals, or autographs as they're also called, they're lost as far as we know. And so that means, that said, all the evidence, that'd be manuscripts, the physical evidence, versions, that'd be translations into different languages, secondary sources like church fathers, they agree significantly overall. However, there are many differences because the New Testament was copied so many times. And these differences are called variants. So, for example, if you have one reading that says Christ Jesus and another reading that says Jesus Christ, well, that's a variant because every jot and tittle. Or if there's a different spelling or a different spelling of a word proper, a noun, whatever it is, just any difference at all. Or if you have, let's say, a verse in the Bible, and in one copy it's all in the paragraph, and another copy, part of it's in the margin, like a gloss. And so where does it really belong? Does it belong in the paragraph, or was it taken from the margin and put into the paragraph? Those are the type of things that textual criticism deals with. And so it tries to resolve these variants, or where the copies disagree, by trying to determine what the author likely wrote. And so there's a lot of factors that go into that. And so, they don't even really try to do that anymore. They've sort of given up on trying to go back to the originals. And now they just try to find the earliest text. And so the science, the raw science of textual criticism no longer claims to be able to get you back to the original text. And at the late 19th century, that was not the case. When pioneers Westcott and Hort, which we'll talk about later, came up with the first critical Greek New Testament, and they claimed it was going back to the original, but no one claims that anymore. Not with the coherence-based genealogical method. And so there's been a lot of changes. And so the next series that will follow this one will be about tradition, and why, speaking for myself, I believe the Christian faith because it's been handed down, mostly subjectively. My personal experience with the Christian faith. And even though I do believe in theistic proofs for myself, and I do believe in the truths of the Christian faith, I do not believe that you can argue for the truth of the Christian faith, or argue for the Bible, or argue for creation using secular science. And so that's a big topic. But one of the things that I want to instill in Catholic educators, Christian educators, is to... Anyway, let's get back to textual criticism. So scholars debate what actually the goal of textual criticism is. It's no longer to recover the text of the autographs. I mean, that was the goal at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's many theories going around. For example, were there multiple copies made by the original authors, right? Did the Apostle Paul send out multiple copies that were different? So, and then what happens if an alteration later, let's say that the Gospel of Matthew is preserved by the Matthean community, and a couple hundred years after it was written, the community decides to make some changes and it becomes accepted reading. Does that become authentic? And if you believe in tradition, you might tend to believe that there's sort of a living tradition, and that or things that are no longer accepted by the modern scholars we might consider authoritative commentary. For example, here Bart Ehrman takes a somewhat different direction, suggests that when an early scribe changed the text to provide a more orthodox theological viewpoint, he may then have created a new original text. So this raises several questions. What happens if the new alteration becomes popularly accepted by the church as the more authoritative text? Is the other virtually lost, except as a variant of the text? Do we have two original texts? So that's quite interesting. So those are the type of things that are debated. And as I'd mentioned, some scholars even would argue that the text should not be viewed as fixed or static, but that is a moving stream or a living text, a living tradition. And so the goal is a plausible reading. So scholars question the accuracy of the transmission. Helmut Koester states that whatever evidence there is indicates that not only minor but also substantial revisions of the original text have occurred during the first 100 years of the transmission. Bart Ehrman supports that view as well. And as I'd mentioned, someone argued about the text should be viewed as moving or a living text. However, it's unlikely that writings will be altered while authors are still alive. Paul sometimes requested that his letters be circulated to other churches. You could see that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16. And thus, the autographs must have been copied almost immediately. And you'd find it hard to believe that people would change Paul's text while he was still alive. So that's another factor. So let's restate the plausible goal for textual criticism. So we're not saying it's impossible to restore the original text in all cases. A plausible goal for the New Testament textual criticism is the recovery of the original readings of the text, or in some cases it may be necessary to identify the earliest possible readings, which that's quite ubiquitous actually, according to the newest technologies in the 21st century. But so it's not possible to know for certain that we have original reading, but they say that only 6% of the Greek text is in question, but 6%. So there's 138,000 words in the New Testament. So 6% of that is in question. That's quite a bit, really, if you think about it. Which parts are in question, and that's always changing now. With the new paradigms, it's constantly churning. They're working on the 29th edition of the Nestle Aland Critical Greek New Text. So 29 versions since, the beginning of the 20th century. Bruce Metzger, the late Bruce Metzger, who is the preeminent 20th century textual critic, states it this way. Although in very many cases the textual critic is able to ascertain without residual doubt which reading must have stood in the original, there are not a few other cases where he can come only to a tentative decision based on an equivocal balancing of probabilities. Occasionally, none of the variant readings will commend itself as original, and he will be compelled either to choose the reading which he judges to be the least unsatisfactory or to indulge in conjectural emendation. In textual criticism, as in other areas of historical research, one must seek not only to learn what can be known, but also to become aware of what, because of conflicting witnesses, cannot be known. So, there you have it. There's a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty. So there are a lot of copy errors and variants and so on, because just the abundance of copies. And this is physical evidence, and this number changes all the time, because while they're gathering manuscripts and so on, they'll find out that there have been double entries and so on. They're trying to digitally capture all of these at the Center of New Testament Textual Criticism, whatever, the Daniel B. Wallace effort, where they're going around and taking photographs of manuscripts, and they have a digital library which anyone can go up and look at for free. But so right now, according to Peter Gurry, who we'll talk about later, the number's about 5,300 manuscripts. And so manuscripts are, well, we'll talk about manuscripts later. And how old are these? So in some cases, New Testament manuscripts date to within 50 to 100 years after the originals. For example, the Papyrus 457 in the Rylands Library, it's called P52, is thought to be dated at AD 125 to 150. And so the Gospel of John, it's from the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John ranges anywhere from AD 40 to 110. And so the interval between the authorship of the evangelist and the extant manuscript evidence is very short. It's a short interval. But it doesn't go all the way back. And so to give you an idea of these manuscripts, by the way, they're not in full New Testaments. Okay, they're anything from just a little fragment with a word or verse or whatever, to a codex, which is a book, and parchments and so on. We'll get into that more later. But in terms of the physical evidence, that are extant words that belong in biblical copies alone. We're not talking about church fathers. We're not talking about versions of translations or any of that. We're talking about Greek fragments that are copies, manuscript copies. As we said, there are 5,300 of these. But how many words are there? There's about 2 million extant words that are contained in these 5,300 manuscripts. And as I said, the New Testament, when you collate, when you choose your readings and then you finally decide what is the New Testament, you end up with about 38,000 words in a finished Greek New Testament. So it's 2 million extant words contained in 5,300 manuscripts to produce about 138,000 words in a finished Greek New Testament product. I shouldn't say finished, because it's never finished. Let's call it the latest edition of a working assumption. That's really what we have today. You don't really have a Bible today. What you have is the latest version of a working assumption, subject to change, because that's all they do is change it. Now, I have a few other entries here to show you that, well, the apologists for the Greek New Testament, the evangelical apologists, like to speak of the embarrassment of riches. There's 5,300 manuscripts in comparison. The Julius Caesar Gallic War has 10, and this History and Annals by Tacitus has only 2. So it is true that the Greek New Testament does have an embarrassment of riches. Lots of copies in comparison to other ancient works from that time frame. So I want to keep these videos at about a half an hour, so this is a good time to stop. And when we pick it up next time, we'll get into the type of transmission errors, and we'll begin with unintentional changes. So thanks for your attention, and see you in the next episode.